Welcome, and thank you for joining APQC's October webinar, Understanding Millennials in the Supply Chain. A few things to note during the webinar. We will be live tweeting, so be sure to join the conversation on Twitter and use the hashtag #SCMAPQC. Also, as a reminder, audio is available through your computer speakers or dial-in lines, and all attendee lines are muted. This is the Q&A tool located on the right of your screen. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them here and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and you will receive a copy of the slides as well as a recording in a few days. I would now like to take a moment to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. We have APQC's Marisa Brown, the Senior Principal Research Lead for Supply Chain Management as well as Financial Management here at APQC. We also have Alyssa Tucker, the Principal Research Lead for Human Capital Management, as well as Ryan Sullivan, our Research Analyst for Supply Chain Management and Human Capital Management here at APQC. I would now like to pass the webinar off to Marisa.
Thank you so much, Maddie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We look forward to talking with you about the millennials in the supply chain. Who are they, and why did they enter the supply chain field? And some of the things that we'll be sharing may be new to some of you. Some of it may be counter to what you've heard in the media, and we look forward to debunking some of those myths. We'll then examine what positions they're in currently, as well as what they like and dislike about their job. We'll then examine what their job tenure looks like and what their plans are for the future. After we finish sharing the results of this research with you, we will then be taking questions and answers, or we'll be taking questions and hopefully providing answers to everyone on the call. With that said, let's jump right into understanding who are the millennials in the supply chain. And for that, I turn it over to my colleague, Ryan Sullivan, who himself is a millennial studying supply chain.
Thanks, Marisa. First, let's start with a little background. As more millennials enter the marketplace, managers and organizations are recognizing that their workforce is changing. And some of them have come to us asking for help identifying exactly what is changing in the workforce and what they need to do to adjust to it. So we decided to do a study with SCMR, APICS, and PRG to find out more about this highly competitive and techno-savvy generation. And for the purposes of this study, all respondents are between the ages of 22 and 37, and we had a total of 676 qualified respondents. Here we see an age breakdown of the millennials in our study. It's a pretty even split down the middle, and if you look at the more detailed breakdown, you'll see a few more participants in the middle of the age range. No surprise. And for the educational background, we see that 60% have completed formal education directly in logistics or supply chain. We also found out that almost 90% have completed at least a four-year degree of any kind. For me, I know I fall into the 40% on this one. My education was actually in industrial engineering, which then led me into supply chain. So what types of education have millennials completed? Many have professional certifications and degrees in supply chains, and some have received training on the job and through conferences or workshops. When we asked about the main focus of their supply chain education, here's how they responded. First was no surprise, with the fundamentals of supply chain, then supply chain strategy, operations, supplier management, supply chain design, and then a few focused on finance and management. One topic we wanted to know more about was, what are millennials most interested in? And we can see that the top answer is supply chain design and planning. Then in a close group, we have demand planning, business intelligence, inventory management, and one of my favorites, lean management. And to talk a little more about why millennials are entering the supply chain, I'll hand it over to Alyssa.
Thank you, Ryan. So as Ryan said, I'm going to talk about why millennials are entering the supply chain. And just see if I can get that slide to advance. There we go. So APQC's general research into the millennial generation has shown that millennials seek interesting and meaningful work. They seek competitive rewards, and they're also looking for continuous learning and advancement. And we see all of these things in our research project that we're talking about today, which is specifically focused on millennials in the supply chain profession. Our survey asked millennials to explain in their own words why they entered the supply chain field. And their responses illustrate the importance that millennials place on having that satisfying work, strong pay, and favorable career prospects. So I want to read to you some of the written responses that our supply chain millennials provided to us regarding why they entered the field. First, it was a chance to create something new and explore an underdeveloped part of the business. Lots of time to problem solve, work cross-functionally, and better hours. Another supply chain millennial shared, to be able to work in a moving and challenging environment, combining technical as well as managerial skills. I consider supply chain as the backbone of any company. And then we have this quote, there are ample opportunities to solve problems, collaborate across different business functions, take decisions that impact profitability and customer satisfaction. And I'll share one last quote, problem solving, analytical, fast moving, plus I knew the field had strong employment and wage prospects. So these are some of the open-ended survey responses. I want to turn now and look at what our survey data shows about why millennials entered supply chain. So first, we'll look at the survey data related to meaningful work. Then we'll take a look at what the data has to say about the importance of competitive rewards to supply chain millennials. And then we'll look at the continuous learning and advancement piece of what millennials are looking for in supply chain. Okay, so on this slide, we see that 75% of our survey respondents started their careers in supply chain, and 81% indicated that a top reason for entering the field was that it is one in which they feel they can make a difference. And so if you think about those quotes that I just read from those millennial survey participants, they were talking about many different things about the supply chain field that allow them to find meaning and feel like they're making a difference in their work. So what we heard about were the chance to create something new in an underdeveloped area of the business, the opportunity to solve problems in a fast-moving and challenging environment, the ability to be the backbone of the business, and the chance to make decisions that impact profitability and customer satisfaction. So truly, those are words that show the meaning and ability to make a difference that these millennials are finding in the supply chain field. And I just wanted to reiterate that a number of the millennials mentioned the attractiveness of being able to help deliver products or goods to the end customer. That was something that they said was important to them that they found in their supply chain careers. So when citing reasons for entering the supply chain field, the millennials in our survey talked about the field having many available job opportunities and good pay. And in fact, compensation matters for all employees, not just millennials. And when we look at APQC's open standards benchmarking data, we see that the #1 reason for unwanted turnover among all employees is higher compensation elsewhere. So employees are leaving their employers to seek better pay at other employers. However, I want to point out that millennials as a generation, they have some particularly strong reasons to care about compensation. And I have a great quote from one of our millennial survey participants, which really explains, I think, why the millennial generation and millennials in supply chain care about compensation. This millennial said, "Growth and opportunity is what attracted me to this field. Also, being a college graduate with student loans, this field pays well and will allow me the opportunity to have a great salary, just as my parents did after they graduated college. Nowadays, the same cannot be said about a lot of college graduates in other career fields." A pretty powerful quote there. Another millennial just simply noted supply chain is a growing field. So as early career individuals with unprecedented levels of student loan debt, and experience of seeing jobs and even entire fields of work dry up because of things such as globalization and technological advances, Millennials value both jobs that pay well today, as well as fields or professions that hold the promise of continuing to offer jobs that will pay well in the future. And as you can see from this slide, the data here shows that supply chain jobs do pay well for millennials today. The average base salary is over $67,000 for the millennial supply chain professionals who participated in our survey. So our open standards benchmarking data at APQC shows that closely following higher compensation elsewhere as the top reason employees leave their employers are two other reasons for overall employee turnover. And these are to take a more prestigious position or to pursue career advancement at another organization. And here again, our millennial supply chain survey data shows that millennials in the supply chain are not totally different from employees of other generations working in other fields. And from this slide, if you take a look at that second bar on this bar chart, you'll see that 87% of the millennials in our survey agree that working in the supply chain field will help them with their personal growth and development. And then 88% of our millennial participants see the supply chain field as offering job advancement opportunities. So all generations today have reason to be concerned about maintaining their employability, and development and advancement. These are two ways to maintain employability. The millennials, though, as a generation, I think have reason to be particularly interested in learning and advancement. So as early career individuals, millennials have to think about maintaining their employability over a longer time horizon. So with more of their working years ahead of them, millennials are especially eager to be working in jobs and in fields that offer them the ability to maintain their employability through continuous learning and the promise of advancement opportunity. As one millennial survey participant explained, working in supply chain offers lots of learning opportunities and challenges every day. Another millennial shared that in supply chain, there are many available job opportunities. So this was a look at why millennials chose to enter the supply chain field. They value meaningful work, competitive compensation, and learning and advancement potential that they see in supply chain jobs, as well as the supply chain field in general. So now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Marisa, and she's going to share some specifics about the current supply chain positions that millennials are working in.
Thanks, Alyssa. So I want to look at where in the supply chain are millennials starting off their careers, then where are they today? And then I want to look at the myth, or perhaps not myth, of job hopping among millennials. So let's look at where millennials are starting and staying in supply chain. So the 670 plus participants in our survey research answer the question of whether or not they were in their first supply chain role, and 60% of them said yes. And when we asked what that role was, you see a pretty even split with planning, then procurement, manufacturing, inventory management, logistics, followed by distribution and transportation. And we see a sizable chunk, about 1 in 5, in some other role within supply chain. So being curious, we want to know what those other roles were that they started in. And we see data analytics, materials management, operations management, project management, supply chain consulting, a wide range of things for that other category of where they started. So if you keep in mind that we had predominantly this 17 to 12% range on these first positions across these different roles, when we look at where they are today, so the 40% who are not still in their first job, where are they? And it's interesting to see that there was some movement. We're in the same order from largest to smallest, so there's still more folks in the planning area, but we saw the increase in planning came mainly from logistics, manufacturing, and distribution. So as they're moving out of their initial jobs, many of them seem to be moving over to the supply chain planning area. So one of the things, if you read the popular press, one of the things you hear about millennials in general is this notion that they're not loyal, they're job hopping, they're moving around, don't bother training them because they'll be gone tomorrow. And what I'm happy to say is when we looked at this data, that does not hold true for the supply chain millennials in our research. When we look at this, we see that in some ways that what our data displays is a function of the age of our participants. As Ryan showed earlier, they're between the ages of 22 and 37, but when we look at the older employees, you would expect to see a larger number of employees for them. However, as you look at this chart, the gray bar is the older group in our demographics here. Even at that level, at that career tenure, we're seeing that very few have 5 or more employers, or even 4 or more employers. And in fact, when we look at this, for those aged 26 to 29, so not the youngest group, because the youngest group you see, many of them are still in their first employment position, but the second group, half of them are still with their first or second employer, more than half of them. And the same holds true even for our older batch, ages 34 to 37. So we're seeing that there is a tendency not to leave employers. Now they may shift roles, as we saw, 40% of them have moved from their original role, but they may still be in the same company, showing that there is a tendency in the supply chain arena to find that meaning that Alyssa was talking about, the value, the ability to make a difference and contribute to customer satisfaction in the supply chain arena that is very appealing to these millennials. So not so much in terms of job hopping like we've heard, and that's the good news. So what is it specifically about their jobs that they like and don't like? I'm going to turn it over to Ryan now to talk a little bit more about what we found.
Thanks, Marisa. One of the main focuses of the study was to find out what millennials liked and disliked about their job. So organizations could adjust their tactics to attract and keep millennial talent. Some of the things that millennials reported they liked most about their job was that their job was challenging, they liked the work itself, they value their relationships with their colleagues, they like a high level of responsibility, and their development opportunities in the supply chain field. Most millennials in supply chain know what they signed up for, and they're excited about the work. So feel free to drop them in the deep end and see what happens. When we ask millennials what parts about their job they don't like, most of the responses centered around things that get in their way of progress or moving forward. Things like lack of clearly defined work processes, lack of knowledge transfer or training, and lack of needed resources or technology. And I know that technology is a big one for me. Most millennials coming out of school have studied in their classes the best examples of companies out there in supply chain. And we have a good idea of what technology and tools they have available to them to accomplish whatever it is they've accomplished. And I can think of one example in my first job. I worked actually for an urgent care clinic, and we were tasked with making sure the clinics had the right resources to process the patients. So we had to make sure the right number of doctors, nursing, front office staff, and then all the equipment like x-ray machines and stuff to help get these people through their clinics. And so it was literally my first week. We sat in a room with my manager, and we had a list of how long each patient takes to get through the building, and we found out it was less than 30 minutes of actual work to get most of the patients through the building, but it was over an hour and a half of time they actually spent in the building, so they were waiting most of their time. And so we had some time studies about how long it takes for each patient to do each part and how many people came in the building per hour. So we literally went on the whiteboard, wrote 8 a.m., patient 1 walks in, goes to the front desk, spends 30 seconds, sits down, spends 5 minutes filling out paperwork, go through the front office, the back office, and so on. And so it was my first week of work, so I was afraid to say anything. Then after about 30 minutes of going through this by hand, we had made it to about 8:08 a.m. I said, guys, in school we had a simulation software that could do this. And we could put all this information in there and it would figure it out for much quickly. And he looked at me and said, I think you're right. So we stopped, we broke, we found some simulation software. It took a couple weeks, but then we were able to program all this into the software, and we were able to help out a large number of clinics very quickly, showing them how much staff they needed, how much equipment they needed to process their patients. And if we look, the number one answer in this section was unclear career path for upward mobility. And I think this is important for millennials as well. Most of them have just gotten out of school, and they're used to having a list of things to do in order to move on to the next grade or the next class. And in the business world, this can be quite different. But I think organizations would be doing themselves a favor by clearly laying out what qualifications are needed in order to be promoted. I think it will motivate millennials and give them a target to work towards and achieve. And to look at millennials' career and tenure, I'll hand it back to Alyssa.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan. I really like your story and your example. When I see that slide that we just looked at about the top things that millennials in supply chain dislike about their current job, and I see things like lack of resources or technology systems and lack of clearly defined work processes, I think what your example shows is a great way to address these dislikes if you're an employer, which is to put it in the millennials' hands, tap into their knowledge of technology, and use them to help them create the solution in that case. So I think that is a great example. So thank you. And we're going to turn now and talk about what does tenure look like for millennials in supply chain. So I want to look at this slide's got a lot of data on it, and so what it's showing us here is information about millennials' tenure in their current supply chain jobs at their current employers, as well as in the supply chain field. And what really all of this taken together, I think, shows us is that as millennials are progressing in their supply chain careers, they are changing jobs, but to a lesser extent, they're changing employers. I want to note that changing jobs as one's career is progressing, that's a path, as I think we've been talking about, it's a path to continuous learning and advancement, something that, as we've been talking about, we know supply chain millennials want. The fact that tenure in current job is lower than tenure at current employer suggests to me that many of our supply chain millennials are able to learn and advance without changing employers. So all of this is good news for supply chain employers. And just to put this into perspective, Marisa was talking about job hopping and how our millennials in supply chain don't hold up to the myth of millennial job hopping. And when you actually do look at job hopping data, both changing employers and mainly changing employers, our sample here from this survey changes employers a lot less frequently than the general millennial population. So that's great. That really is great news for supply chain employers. One thing, though, that I do want to note is you can see on this slide that nearly 3/4 or 73% of our millennial supply chain participants have been in their current role for a year or more. So this indicates to me that many are likely already looking or about to start looking for learning and advancement opportunities. So need to keep, as employers and managers, our eye on that ball. In fact, our survey data suggests that millennials' commitment to the supply chain field is stronger than their commitment to their supply chain jobs. This data shows that while 49% of our supply chain millennials are very satisfied with their career, only 32% are very satisfied with their current job. So I think the data on this slide, combined with what we just saw on the previous slide, really are a call to action for employers to build commitment to your organization so that you reduce the need for millennial supply chain workers to seek what they want at another supply chain employer. And one important way to do this is to stay focused on providing your millennial supply chain workforce with learning and advancement opportunities. even if it's not the time for them to advance yet, make sure that they are seeing that there is a clear path forward at your organization, which goes back to that recommendation Ryan was making. Make sure they can see what they need to do to advance and grow. So I'm going to turn things back now to Marisa, and she's going to talk about the future plans of millennials in supply chain and some things that employers can do to make sure they're meeting both the current as well as the future needs of their millennial supply chain workers.
Thanks, Alyssa. Well, it's nice to see positive data and positive news about our millennials in the supply chain. And what we've been looking at is, starting with Ryan, we talked about what their educational background looks like, how old they are. We learned a little bit about who they are, and then we started looking at what their jobs are, what they like, what they don't like, their tenure. Well, now we're going to shift gears and look to the future. So we've established through what we've shared so far that the millennials in the supply chain are there intentionally. For many of them, this was their intended job out of college, and they've stayed in the supply chain arena. They're finding meaning and value. They are looking for ways to make the world a better place, if that's not a little too motherhood and apple pie sounding. But now let's talk about where they want to go in terms of furthering their education, in terms of 2 years from now, and then the longer term. And then I want to throw you some ideas about what employers can do to really retain these millennials. So we've talked a lot about on their own finding so much meaning and value, and the compensation helps, that they want to stay in supply chain, but as everyone knows, it's less of an expense and less disruptive to keep existing employees than it is to have to go out and recruit new ones all the time. So let's start with looking at plans for future learning. And it shouldn't surprise you at this point, but millennials plan to continue learning. 2/3 of them, in fact, have said that they plan to take continuing education programs or classes in the next 12 months. Now, some of this has to do with certification. When we look at what drives some of the behavior, it's the fact that individuals are looking for personal advancement. So we see that for 3/4 of them, getting this continuing education program will help them with moving up in their career. And then we see for more than half of the participants, it's about improving their current performance in their current job. They want to do the best that they can do in the roles that they're in. And then we see 47% saying, hey, it's also about I want more challenging work and more responsibilities. It's about really finding, again, that meaning and that value and being a problem solver and helping to move things forward. And then we still see, as Alyssa said, they're human, just like the rest of us. They're looking to pay off their student debt. They're looking to make it in a successful way in the world. They want to increase their current base compensation as well. So we asked them, 5 years from now, what do you think? Will you still be working in the supply chain? Overwhelmingly, we see 83% said that they're here to stay. And that's really encouraging. Very small percentage, only 3 said no. We have a larger group, 13%, that's just not sure. And that's really, again, kind of a human response, because who knows what 5 years from now can bring for many of us. But for these millennials in the supply chain, this is where they want to be and where they want to stay. So we asked them, in 2 years from now, where do you want to be? What do you want to be doing here in the supply chain? And we see that half of them said they want to be involved in supply chain design and planning. And you'll see that all throughout the data we've shared. There's a very strong attraction to the planning arena. And then we see business intelligence and analytics, Ryan's favorite of Lean Six Sigma. And then we see, again, demand planning and forecasting, including sales and operations planning, and robotics process automation. So what we're seeing is these emerging technologies, from the robotics side, from the analytics side. There is a lot of appeal there for this generation that could be considered, in some ways, digital natives. Using Ryan's example, they're learning about the latest and greatest technologies in college, and they want to be able to apply those in the workspace. We also see that this attraction to design and to planning is critical, because as we're moving into a world where there's much greater uncertainty in terms of demand, it's no longer predicting how many people will walk into your store on Main Street to buy products. It's now all new channels. This omni-channel and digitalization of the supply chain is driving much greater volatility for demand. So millennials, who may have a better pulse on where the next viral video is going to happen, are very much attracted to this element of the supply chain and understanding the impact on demand. Then we asked about the longer term. Where do you see yourself down the road, far beyond the 2- and 5-year horizon? So interestingly, we see that the #1 choice was senior supply chain analyst. Again, there's a lot of this analytical skill set and analytical capability that the millennials are bringing to bear on the supply chain. And as the world of big data only gets bigger and more complex, and sensors and all those things take over, we're going to need people who can analyze all that and make sense of it. So this is a very welcome thing to see. And then we see there's still some technical flavor throughout here. Obviously down the road, they're looking at management roles, more senior management roles, but in a realistic sense, we only had 2% say they want to be CEO. And nobody on here said they wanted to be a firefighter, but what we're seeing is a lot of roles within procurement and supply chain, materials management, a small group that's interested in owning their own small supply chain consultancy. So the focus, though, is staying in the supply chain and really trying to make that world a better place. And one way that millennials have indicated they want to continue in the supply chain is making sure they stay informed about future opportunities. So what's going on? Where are the openings? Where are the opportunities for me to grow in new roles, in new employment, in new ideas and new concepts? So we see on here that there's a mix of face-to-face activities, as well as those things that they can do from behind their computer or phone or tablet. So the #1 way they stay informed is peers and colleagues. It's the human networking. And we saw earlier in quite a bit of the data, collaboration come up quite a bit. And that's something that in the supply chain context is a critical skill. And then we see that they're looking at publications and websites from both general business perspectives as well as the unique supply chain world, both of which can inform the future of supply chain and where the opportunities are going. So they're keeping their eye on the big picture as well as understanding in the industry what's happening. We see webinars on here, industry associations, can't get away from social media. That's an ever-present opportunity these days. But what we don't see on here is their corporate HR department. And that's an opportunity that millennials may not be tapping into right now, because especially in larger firms, there are a lot of opportunities within the organization. And we saw that they tend to stay in their companies. So that's one where we would recommend employers try and raise the visibility of their own HR department as a source of opportunity for future ideas for the millennials in their supply chain. So in terms of other things employers can do to retain their millennials in the supply chain arena, we have 6 suggestions. So first of all, we want to tap into this millennial desire to grow, whether it's in their existing organization or a new one. But employers can really focus on creating an environment that helps attract and retain the millennial supply chain employee. So there are things here that employers can do around providing continuous opportunities for development, like formal training, covering the cost of conference attendance, or also putting them in stretch assignments, typically with a mentor, or even including job rotation as part of it. But considering that they need to help the millennials reach the next step on their career path. And as Ryan said, making it very clear what skills are needed to help an employee move from being in inventory management today to design and planning in 2 years, or some other movement like that. The second thing we recommend for employers is foster mentoring relationships. As we saw, the #1 way they want to keep informed about future opportunities is through peers and colleagues. It's a lot of collaboration here that millennials find appealing. So making sure that they tap into one of millennials' big likes, this relationship with colleagues, can help employers keep those folks around. Communicate career advancement opportunities, as I mentioned. If these employees are looking for a solid career, this is more important than things like having a foosball table or free food in the break room. These are employees who are really looking for meaning, not fluff. Engage them in process improvement. Getting the millennials involved in helping to work out best practice work processes and even building the business case for needed resources really helps the millennial, and it helps the employer give those millennials what they want and offers an increasing level of responsibility. Again, another one of those things we heard millennials are looking for. So again, Ryan's example was great. There is often a better way that those of us who've been in these organizations for a long time might miss. And bringing in the millennials as a fresh set of eyes lets us come up with new and different ways of solving problems and challenges. Next, ensure competitive compensation. And while this isn't a top like or dislike, as Alyssa mentioned, it's not low on the list either. Fair, market competitive compensation matters, but by itself, it's not sufficient enough to attract, engage, or retain your millennials. But without it, you're gonna have a hard time keeping them around. And then lastly, as we've been saying, provide meaning and purpose. 81% of millennials in our research believe they can make a difference in the field. And that is something that not a lot of fields can say. Tapping into that as an organization can really help to retain your millennials around, keep them around long into the future. So with that said, just a little bit of background about the research. As Ryan mentioned, this was a joint partnership that APQC conducted with Supply Chain Management Review and APICS. And what we are now happy to do is take any questions that you all might have for us. Maddie?
Yep, thanks Marisa, Alyssa, and Ryan. As Marisa stated, we're going to go ahead and open the floor for questions, so be sure to use that chat function on the right side of your screen and submit those questions. We're going to kick it off here with the first one. How are millennials different from other generations?
Here, I can start that. I'm a millennial, so one thing we hear about is, they're not loyal to their career, or sorry, not their career, their employer. I think I saw that from both my parents were laid off early 2000s, and it just showed me, times got rough for those companies, and then they had to lay those people off. So I think it was a difference that we saw there that said, hey, maybe I shouldn't be so loyal to my organization, but I still like my career. Because, when times go bad, anything can happen. And I don't think that's something different about millennials in themselves. I just think that's something different that they saw. I think if the other generation had seen that, an older generation, they would have the same feelings as well. So I think it's just a different of experience, but not necessarily a different in that they're different in their core person and who they really are.
I think that brings up, Alyssa, a really good point is that, across all the generations, there really are some key commonalities, which is the desire, to make a living, and the point that Ryan gets at, and to be able to support yourself, be able to support your loved ones. I think some of this search for meaning in life and in work is something that the generations share at kind of a deep root level in terms of what they're looking for from their work. I think what's different about the generations and how they approach their work, some of that comes from the different, formative experiences that they've had growing up. And Ryan mentioned the one, that, you can't be loyal. Maybe you shouldn't be loyal to your employer because you can lose your job. And having seen that affects how you approach work. I think some of the other formative experiences that we've talked about here today are, growing up with computers and digital technology and mobile devices. That's a formative experience. This is also, the millennials are a highly educated generation, and certainly how they were parented can affect their behaviors and their attitudes towards work. They tended to have highly scheduled childhoods and intensive parenting, and some of them have very close and sometimes friendship-like relationships with their parents, and those kind of formative experiences can be unique to each generation and drive some of the differences, but there's also some commonalities, I think, also that we need to remember to look for when we're thinking about generations and work.
Great. The next question we have is, can you explain a little bit more what you mean by the term millennial?
Sure. So I think that we can answer that from a strict research design point of view. So for the purposes of this research, we were looking for millennials as defined as people between the ages of 22 and 37. So that, and I should say, in the popular media, there's a little bit of wiggle room, and you know, this isn't something that can be scientifically defined once and for all across the universe, but that's how we were defining it: people who generally have completed college and are not yet in senior management roles, so in that 22 to 37 year range.
Yeah, and I think that for the people in this study, we were targeting supply chain professionals, so this may not be completely representative of every millennial, but these are, again, kind of like Marisa just said, they're the educated ones that are in supply chain. So some of the things you've heard about millennials may be a little bit different because we're not looking at all millennials, again, just millennials in the supply chain.
Right, these are millennials who are employed in a very productive environment, who find a lot of meaning in the work. So,
and probably not living in their mom's basement.
Yeah, exactly.
And so kind of touching on that, it sounds kind of from the webinar that millennials are that high maintenance generation, or people that you should really pay attention to in your workforce. But what about these other generations that we have? Why are the millennials such a big audience, I guess, to think about in terms of your organization?
I would say, Alyssa, the number one reason is really demographics, in my opinion. This is really your future workforce if you're an employer. So you have the large baby boomer generation, followed by a smaller generation X, and then you've got the millennials, who are a generation that are almost, not quite, but getting up there in size, to a size similar to the baby boomers. From a demographic perspective, this is going to be, if it isn't already, your pool to recruit talent from.
I agree, Alyssa. This is Marisa, and I think that we've put a name to the generation, but in reality, it's the younger employees entering the workspace and what are they looking for. As a proud member of the very small Generation X, I think that it's the fact that we've got this large pool, as Alyssa said, of baby boomers, many of whom are retiring, many of whom are the leaders of the organizations, and there's a big difference in terms of whether it's technology orientation, the experiences they had during their formative years, with the new folks coming in the door. And I think it's the important thing to take away from this isn't the label millennial so much as these are the young folks working in supply chain today. What can we do as supply chain professionals to ensure that we continue to provide an environment that is value-added, meaningful, and benefits both the organization and the individual?
Yeah, and I'd add, I mean, the world has changed. And so, try to look at, millennials probably bring, because of their formative experiences, some, attitudes and outlooks and skills that, your business probably really needs. So, really take a look at the benefit your organization will get from learning to work well with this generation.
Great. We're going to do one last question here. What about the supply chain really attracts those millennials?
So this is Marisa, and I think that we've talked about this in different ways during this webinar, but when you look at all the processes that exist inside an organization, there are your operating processes and your support processes. So you can't get more fundamental to what differentiates one business from another than the value add that supply chain brings to that enterprise. And when APQC talks about supply chain, we're including supply chain planning, your procurement and purchasing area and sourcing, manufacturing, logistics and reverse logistics, all under this umbrella. And that is really where the rubber meets the road of the meat of an organization. And so that truly is where the meaning can be added, and I feel like that's why this is such an appealing arena for a generation that's seeking meaning. The supply chain can make or break the success of the company in ways that perhaps those handling other support areas can maybe enhance, but aren't as directly connected to making or breaking the experience with the customer. So I think that that's a big piece of it, that supply chain is the heart of the organization. And I would throw the product development engineering group in there with them in many ways as well.
Yeah, and I think that this generation has been told maybe differently from other generations of, find out whatever you like and do what you like. So I think we see the younger generation getting to their jobs, it's probably something they really like. That's why they're more motivated versus maybe the older generations just find a good company and try to work there forever. So I think that's hopefully you get more people that are motivated and they like their job more. I think we're starting to see more of that.
Good point.
As a millennial, I would agree with that point.
Alyssa?
I was just going to say, Marisa, you were talking about supply chain as the heart of the organization, and I think that's, really gets at what it is, that bottom line of what appeals to millennials about the supply chain field is that as the heart of the organization, it is an opportunity to be doing meaningful work, and then meaningful work that provides career and financial stability, because the organization needs supply chain. So I think that's why it's so attractive to millennials, probably.
All right, thank you again, Marisa, Ryan, and Alyssa, for that wonderful presentation. I definitely know more about millennials and the supply chain, and I hope all of our listeners do as well. If you'd like to learn more about the research or dig into some of our resources we have available, be sure to visit this link, as we have a lot of different articles there for you to browse through and read. Also, visit our expertise pages to learn more about supply chain management as well as human capital management and managing people throughout your organization on our website. And connect with us through all of our social outlets. We post a lot of upcoming webinars, new content, all different kinds of things, so be sure to reach out to us there. And take a couple minutes, if you don't mind, and take our post-webinar satisfaction survey to let us know what you think about today's webinar, and we hope to see you on next month's webinar. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful day.